Okay, so now we're going to insert a node into our linked list. And it's going to look like this. At a particular index, we're going to insert a new node that has a particular value. So if you want to code this, go ahead and pause this here. I haven't really given anything away by showing this line, but it is a good way to describe what it is that we're doing. Otherwise, we'll get into this. So I'm going to bring up our linked list here with the indexes. And this is going to be the item that we insert. And just like we saw with get and set, we can't insert this at an index that is out of range. So we can't have anything at the index of -1, or we could say an index less than 0. And we can't have this at an index out here, or we could say an index greater than the length. So we'll say if the index is less than 0, or the index is greater than the length, we're going to return false. So let's remove that and look at if we insert at the index of 0. If we insert this here, we've already written code for adding an item to the beginning of a linked list. So we could say if the index is 0, we're going to return self.prepend and pass it the value. So there are two things I want to point out about this line of code. First, it has the return keyword in here, which is saying once this prepend method runs, we're going to be done. We're not going to keep running code in this method. The other one is the self keyword. So we are running this on this particular instance of the linked list. So we'll remove that. And of course, we can do the same thing on the other end of the linked list. We'll say if the index is equal to the length, we're going to return self.append, very similar to what we did with prepend. So now let's look at all three of these if statements. This one here is if we have an index that is out of range and it returns false. This is if we're adding this to the beginning. This is adding it to the end. So now let's look at inserting this node somewhere in the middle. We're going to insert this at the index of 2, and it will look like this when we're done. So I'm going to remove that for now. In order to do this, we're going to need to have a variable that points to the node before the index where we're inserting this. And the reason why you have it point here instead of the index where you're inserting this is you're going to need the next pointer from that 3 node to point down here. That's going to be temp.next. If you have temp over here, you don't have any way to get to that pointer. So it has to be back here. So we've created a couple of new things here. So let's write the code to create them. The first is we created this node. We'll say new node equals node, and we're going to give it the value of 4 in this case. And then we need to create that temp variable. And we can create that by saying temp equals self.get and just pass it index -1, and it will point that to the appropriate node. Okay, so now let's look at this code. And with the rest of our code so far, we have our 3 if statements. We've created the node, and we've created the variable temp. So let's bring this back up. And the first thing we're going to do is point that next pointer on that new node up to the 23. So we'll say new node.next, and we're going to set that equal to something that is pointing to the 23 node. And that would be temp.next. So we set those equal. That will point that up there. We'll do that with this line of code. New node.next equals temp.next. And then we need to take the arrow from the 3 node that is pointing to the 23 node and have it point to the 4 node. So we'll say temp.next is equal to new node. Like this, temp.next equals new node. That adds that into the list. So let's look at this in with the rest of our code. And the only things left to do is to increment the length by 1, and then we'll return true. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is if this is successful here, we're returning true. And if it's not successful up here, we're returning false. If you'll recall, when we created the prepend method and the append method, we had them return true, and I said that we're going to use both of those in another method later. The insert method, the way we've written this here, it has to return true or false. And by writing the prepend method and the append method the way we did, that allows us to use those inside of this method. Okay, so we'll look at this code in a moment in VS Code. And when we do, we're going to create a linked list with a value of 0 and 2. And then we're going to run the insert method and say at the index of 1, insert a node with the value of 1. Then we should have a linked list with the values of 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so let's flip over to VS Code. So there is our insert method that we just created. And this is where we create our linked list with the values of 0 and 2. And then we're going to print this out to make sure that is correct. Okay, so that is returning 0 and 2. So that is correct. I'm going to take this code. I'm just going to scroll it up here so we can zoom in. And then what I'm going to do is between this creation of the linked list and the print list right here is I'm going to paste in our insert method. And we are inserting an item at the index of 1 with the value of 1. So with that new node inserted, when we do our print list here, this should print out 0, 1, 2. So let's run this. And that is returning 0, 1, 2. So it looks like we have a working method for insert